Video's live.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Wednesday, February 23rd. I'm the committee chair, Director Al Sebring. I'd like to start by acknowledging, as always, that we're gathered on various parts of the traditional and ancestral territories of Coast Salish First Nations. Just a couple of attendance notes. We have some alternates with us today. Director McNeil is in for Director Nicholson, Director Justice in for Director Marsh, and Director Sandhu in for Director McGonigal. Director Stone indicated he will be joining us later. He's got another commitment right now, but he is on his way. His alternate was not available. So with that, can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented, unless anybody has any late items? That's a motion from Director Smith, seconded by... Everybody raise it once. Thank you, Director Yanni DiNardo. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? And opposed? That carries. I would turn to our corporate officer for the next item on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next item is the adoption of the Committee of the Whole meeting minutes of January 26, 2022.
The minutes are before us. Can I have a motion? Moved, seconded. Any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? And opposed? That carries. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item M2 is adoption of the Special Committee of the Whole meeting minutes of January 27th.
Again, a motion. Moved and seconded. Errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? And opposed? That carries. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No business arising from the minutes and no participants for public input, period. So moving down the agenda to reports, item R1 is a report from the Emergency Management Division regarding the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund Emergency Operations Center grant application, and the proposed recommendation is that it be recommended to the board on February 23rd, so to this afternoon's board meeting, that a grant application in the amount of $130,000 be submitted to the Union of BC Municipalities Community Emergency Preparedness Fund initiative for the purchase of a mobile emergency operations center.
Can I have a motion? That's moved and seconded. Discussion. Seeing none, all in favor? And opposed? That carries. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R2 is a report from Emergency Management on the renewal of the Central Island 911 Service Partnership Agreement, and the proposed recommendation is that it be recommended to the board on February 23rd, 2022, that the 5-year partnership agreement between the Cowichan Valley Regional District of Nanaimo, and the City of Nanaimo for the purposes of 911 service delivery be approved.
That's moved by Director Smith, seconded by me. Discussion. I have some questions, but does anybody else? I see Mr. Elzinga's popped up in anticipation of my questions. I'm a little confused, if I might. Last year we, after considerable discussion, moved our fire 911 dispatch over a recommendation from staff to Campbell River rather than Surrey. And that was because we had to get out of Nanaimo because Nanaimo was no longer providing fire 911 dispatch. And yet here we have a recommendation that we renew a contract with Nanaimo. What are they dispatching here? What does this cover, Mr. Elzinga?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may, I'll tackle some of the questions around this. I also have Merrick Ryder, our Emergency Telecommunications Coordinator, on the call today to supplement anything I say with technical information. So I'll see if I can give the layman's version of this. Any 911 call has 3 destinations. So what happens with a 911 call is if a resident picks up the phone after they view an emergency, they dial 911. So the first part of that call, by agreement that we have as the CVRD with the Regional District of Nanaimo and the City of Nanaimo, we send that call to ECOM in Vancouver. ECOM as a primary answering point asks the resident do you want police, ambulance, or fire? If it goes to police, it goes somewhere outside our jurisdiction. If it's ambulance, it goes somewhere outside our jurisdiction. If the resident says fire, then ECOM moves that call to the secondary answering point, which up until June of last year was the same partnership we're talking about today with RDN, Nanaimo, and ourselves, where we funded fire dispatchers to move that call to its third destination, the fire department. So what we discussed last year was the second part of the call. When it went to a fire dispatch center in Nanaimo called Firecom, we changed that, as you're quite correct, to Campbell River for some significant savings. The city of Nanaimo did not want to keep up with technology. We had staffing that we were paying for. This seemed to be a more economical way of doing things. So what we discussed last year was the second part of the call. What we are discussing today is the first part of the call, where a resident says 911 and we, by agreement, send it to ECOM. That service that ECOM provides is funded by telecommunications companies collecting a fee for landlines in our 3 jurisdictions. So that funding pays for the ECOM service. We do have a slight overage over time, so that money has come back to a reserve fund held by the city of Nanaimo, and they distributed that reserve fund to the 3 partners late last year, early this year. We had a reserve fund for the CVRD of just over $600,000. So that was funded by that overage. So what we're asking today is to continue the agreement for the 3 partners for a resident to send their call to ECOM and to have that administered by the city of Nanaimo so we don't have to do it.
So for clarity then, it's not Nanaimo picking up, it's Nanaimo collecting the money from the phone bills and forwarding it to ECOM and doing the accounting and giving us back whatever overage.
Exactly.
That provides a lot of clarity, thank you. Because the second part of this, and just for the board's information, when you call 911 and you say police, that goes to the RCMP dispatch service, which is now located in Saanich, and myself and 7 other South Island mayors are in a huge fight with the province over that because they're trying to download 100% of the costs of that onto partner municipalities, which is why this whole thing kind of flagged for me, because I'm quite involved in that, but I was not aware that this was strictly about flowing through some money. So thank you very much, Mr. Elzinga, for that clarity. Any other questions? Director Smith.
Thank you. So you've indicated that these are from landlines. So anyone with a cell phone is not paying this fee. And that I'm glad I'm connected to a landline at my house so that I am supporting this. Is there anything to do with cell phones and how this also could be collected as a fee? Thank you.
Mr. Elzinga.
I'll try for that one, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Grider might chime in as well. So my understanding is the telecommunication companies do not collect on cell phones, that this is only on landlines, which of course could potentially be an issue in the future as the use of landlines decreases and therefore the funding amounts decrease. And so we do anticipate in a few years' time having that conversation. So my understanding is they don't. I'm not sure whether they can collect off of cell phones. But Mr. Grider, anything you'd like to add on to that?
Mr. Grider.
Mr. Elzinga is correct. The reason it's hard to charge cell phones is they go in and out of region. So if you have a number for Lower Mainland, it's hard to charge for 911 services within the CVRD, for example. So that might change in the future, but for now, it's currently landlines from all of the telecommunications companies.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Smith. Any other questions? Seeing none, we have a motion on the table. All in favor? And opposed? That carries. Thank you. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R3 is a report from Legislative Services seeking input on board orientation for direction.
Okay, there's no recommended motion. This is for discussion and direction. Who wants to start? Director Toporowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just looking at the CVRD orientation calendar, and it looks all great and everything, but I noticed that something is missing from this. Moving towards reconciliation with First Nations, I'm looking for something on there for maybe a day with the elders, or maybe going to an elders luncheon and introducing ourselves as CVRD directors. Just a thought for an addition. Also, when I looked at December 12th, regional issues, First Nations is listed there, and I was just wondering, maybe we could change the wording somehow, like legal issues, or when I read it, I think that First Nations is a problem when you say issues. So just my suggestions. Also, maybe, you know, the recreation of the village workshop. I don't know what it's called now today. I know Michelle's on the call. She might be able to help me out with that, but that is a really good starter for directors for CVRD. Other things that I thought of was maybe information for each director of which nations are within the region as a whole, and then, you know, even further for each director, what nations in their territory, because we're all not going to be here forever, right? So it's a good helpful tool even for refreshing for people that have been here for a long time of what areas are represented in the First Nations. That's my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Toporowski. I'm sure staff will take those into account as they finalize this stuff. I see Mr. Carruthers has popped up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Great input from Director Toporowski, and I think that's something that over the next number of months we need to spend some more time refining that whole orientation topic around the work that we're doing with our First Nations communities in the region, and we will and have and will take note of that as we move forward. In terms of the input that we're looking to the board for at this point in time, or the committee, is things around timing. So if those that have been on the board for a number of terms know that we've had very intensive orientation sessions where we brought the directors in almost immediately following the election for an intensive week-long boot camp where essentially it was like drinking from a fire hose, I think, for those newly elected officials, trying to absorb all of the information. After the last election, you'll recall that we spread that orientation out over a period of time so that it was gave the directors an opportunity to absorb the information as they were actually sitting at the board table, so they could equate the information they were getting to their experiences that they were having as newly elected officials at the board table. The problem we found with that approach was that as time went on, I think the directors were getting a little fatigued with the ongoing training, and we actually got to a point where I believe we started to get so busy with business that we weren't able to provide some of that orientation that the directors would have benefited from. So we're looking for a schedule in the new board that kind of finds that balance between giving you all the information that you need to do your jobs effectively as elected officials, without overdoing it and doing it at a pace that is appropriate. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. And then also just in terms of topics around, you know, we're pretty good at handling the information about the organization and what we do as an organization. those sorts of things. But I think there's also the need for some information for the directors around governance and you know, the directors' roles at the board table, you know, relative to each other, relative to staff, those kinds of things. Looking at some suggestions around who we might bring in to have those conversations with the board.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. I was looking at the list of things, and I won't be here, so it's kind of bittersweet as I look at this because I envy, but I see we've once again proposing to bring in George Cuff, who is, I will grant, the sort of governance guru of Western Canada. I would just ask very respectfully, are we sure we want Mr. Cuff? I've attended many sessions with him over the years, and I'm not sure how to put this diplomatically, but George is not getting any younger. Have we considered any other folks? Brian?
Yeah, so if I can say that the calendar that you have is simply the calendar for the last term. So we just brought that forward for information so that you could see how it was structured in the previous term. I would tend to agree with Chair Sebring, Director Sebring, that I think we really need to look at who's available to come and do that orientation, because sometimes it's good to hear different perspectives. And Mr. Cuff is no doubt an expert and has been around for a long time. But there may be other perspectives that the newly elected officials would care to hear from. So combined with the input from the board, I'm also going to work with my fellow CAOs from the municipal our member municipalities to flesh out who might be available to come and provide that orientation for the board. But your point is taken.
Thank you for that. I've got some other comments, but I'll hold. I see Director Morrison wants to speak. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Having done, you know, a longer drawn-out format as, you know, described in the report, and having a more intensive approach, you know, I'd have to say that, at least from my perspective and how I learn, that the more intense is, you know, basically as soon as we're elected, get the information before us, make sure we've got, you know, hard copy backup materials, reference materials, and get the training done before Christmas. And that way, you know, it's not train as you go, learn as you go. And it's even mentioned in the report that there were numerous absences and canceled sessions due to lack of attendance, and you know, that's never good. So if there was a possibility to condense this, get the training aspect done before Christmas, then new directors can take the material, review some of it, areas that they feel they need more information and training in, review it over the holiday break, and we start the new year with basically fully, or as close to fully trained up board of directors for conducting the people's business. Thank you.
Director Smith.
Thank you. The calendar is obviously something that we all will be considering. One of the things that I would just like to go back to is the reconciliation, and that I believe we have 9 First Nation within our whose territory we are on, and I wouldn't want to focus just on one, and this is to me really important to also include other groups so that we can make sure that each area has a fuller understanding for each group, and I don't want us just to see ourselves focusing on a specific larger when we do have the smaller ones that also need to be looked at. One of the things that I think is important is the understanding from our municipal directors that come to the table along with the electoral area directors is a little bit more understanding of the positions of electoral area directors, the use of staff, and some of the other areas involving that. If we're all sitting at the board table or the committee of the whole, there needs to be a little bit more understanding, I think, when we all arrive at the table. And if there's information regarding electoral areas, that would be perfect included. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Smith. I've got Wilson and Staples. Any other hands before I turn it? Okay, Director Acton. I'll go to Director Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I completely agree with what you said earlier on about the continuing use of certain consultants over and over again. We need to change things. We need to get some new blood in there, and we need to start hearing some much more modern takes on what is going on. So I would fully support the change in looking at very carefully at some of the newer, younger consultants that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wilson, Director Staples, and then Acton and Markman.
One of the the best sessions that I remember going to, I think it was the first term I was elected. It was at an LGLA, at our training LGLA, and they did mock. It was I think it was a lawyers group, and they did mock sessions for, I believe it was for public input. But anyways, it was just an incredible experience for everyone to sort of be in the room and go through conflict. And so I'd like to see something like that where, you know, kind of starting off, there's all the governance pieces, and those things are important to know and understand, but really conflict resolution, mediation, how we engage at the table, that process that everyone went through, it was not only was it really educational, but it put you in the roles of, you know, different directors from different positions, the chair, the public, like everyone had to rotate through all these different roles. And I don't know if there's a way to find out who facilitated that, but it was fantastic. And it really has I still refer to that all these years later in meetings on, you know, okay, looking at it from this perspective and this perspective, and understanding our roles as members of these tables, and how we, you know, how we engage and how we interact, and how we resolve conflict and listen to, you know, different opinions. It was just fantastic. So something like that, I think, right at the beginning, and to work those things into the understanding, you know, as has been mentioned before, our roles and responsibilities, but actually those situational things where we're working through, led by a facilitator, actual experiences, and it recreated experiences. Hands down, you know, learned more in that session than in 90% of any of the other ones that we did related to governance. So something like that would be great.
That was LGLA 2009 Parksville. I was there. I remember it well. The other session I remember from there was they got some crusty old veterans who'd been there for 15 years or better, and, you know,
I think it was 2012. I wasn't here in 29, but yeah, it was. They might have done it in both sessions, but you're right, Al. It was. They had some real, like, a mix of people, and it was just so well done.
Yeah. Director Acton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would really stress that as being a rookie twice almost, the training is important, but recording it, I think, is important, because for us to assume and expect elected officials to attend all of these on the schedule set, I think is unrealistic, considering that the compensation is compared to below the poverty line. And if we are encouraging, or it lends itself to requiring a second income. So we have to be flexible for those reasons. I'm also, there's no mention of the budget and how we are going to support the next board. I think it's unrealistic, having come in twice. after an election, almost green both times. It's a lot to expect to understand the budget and to be able to work all that out. I hope that this board is going to support the next board by doing as much of the budget as possible. And I know that, or I get the sense that staff is reluctant to do that, but I'd like to see something come forward if there's some plans on discussing that in some way, I guess is my question.
So there's actually two questions embedded in there, Brian. The first, I guess, is because we're dealing often with consultants, are they okay with recording the sessions, maybe not making them publicly available, but putting them on a link somewhere so directors can go back if they can't make it? And the second piece is about the budget timing.
Yeah, so in response to the first question, I don't see that being a problem. Obviously, something we would discuss with whoever we had coming in, but I wouldn't foresee that being a problem. I think there's some real benefits to recording those sessions, even to be able to review them partway through the term as a refresher. So I would advocate for that as we select our people to do that training. In terms of the budget, we have been having those conversations. You are going to be receiving as a committee and as a board a debrief from this year's budget process. And one of the things that we want to talk to the committee and the board about is accelerating our budget process again to get us back in line with having the budget approved, adopted in December, if at all possible. We have really suffered these last couple of years in going back to a February, March adoption of the budget, particularly when it comes to capital projects, because we are, again, up against competing with many other local governments, and we're seeing cost inflation, and there would be a real benefit to us doing that. We won't get into detail here on that today. I know that Ms. Wayner and her team will be bringing forward some information to be getting some guidance from the board, but yes, we fully support that, going back to that earlier adoption. It does create challenges with the incoming board because they essentially are going to have to take a leap of faith and trust the work that the previous board had done. But I think we have ways of managing that and supporting the new board in getting as much information as they possibly can early so that they feel comfortable in making those decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. Director Markman.
Thank you, Chair. And I would look forward to getting a lot of this information one day. And I think that speaks to the by-elections and the by-election following COVID.
Yeah, I think he's going to have to turn his video off there, Chair.
Director Markman, your audio is breaking up. If you turn your video off, okay, you probably get better audio. Go ahead.
Good. You don't have to watch me then.
There, just sounding a lot better.
Good. I think so coming in a by-election was a real eye-opener for me because I looked at it more from a perspective of workflow and found that I had little time to go through the material as we were right in the middle of budgets. And that was taking all my time to sort of understand and get into it. And so when I look at this, I would proposal or what was done in the past and they ask about timing. I guess there's two things that I look at. One is what are the expected outcomes and what is the expected workload for the directors. And when you marry those two things together, I'm hoping that an outcome might be about directors being together, learning about each other, having a team approach building out of it so that you come out of that with a sense of, ability to work together. And I think the other piece that come out of it is that I would not want to see this bumping up against what we just talked about with the budget, because I think the workload is too much for anybody. And so I guess I would propose that you move it ahead of the budget discussions and that whether you have to consolidate it into a week or into 2 weeks, that you build on that momentum to say at the end of it, where are we at in terms of knowledge that we've gained, but where are we also at in terms of it as a team building exercise? So those are my two insights. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Martman. I'm not seeing any other hands. Maybe I missed somebody. Oh, Mr. Carruthers, I've got a comment as well, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of other items that we would appreciate some direction on or some insight. We have attempted to do training where we've brought our municipal partners together with the elected officials from the board, and we had traditionally done that through the George Cup presentation. So if you recall, we made those opportunities available for all of the councils in the region to come and join us. I think there's some real benefit to doing that, to having the elected councils and the CBRD electoral areas meet in some form of a venue. So if I see support from the board, we would continue to explore an opportunity for that in some form of a workshop where we had a speaker come in and maybe speak to issues that are more generic across our both of our levels of government. The other item that's come forward is the idea of a field trip and actually getting the new board members out into the community and maybe visiting some of our facilities really early on, and not to try and cover off a complete orientation of everything that we do, because obviously we have a very large organization, but maybe just an opportunity under that kind of team building aspiration to get folks out of the environment and in a bus, and maybe we go and tour Bings Creek, or we go and do something that just kind of gets the directors working together as well. So some feedback on whether adding something like that as an element to the orientation would be helpful as well.
I see a hand. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that budget training item didn't get lost that Director Acton brought up. In addition to, if we're moving up, especially to December, even if it's for the existing board. I know I really support so complicated, and so yeah, we could really use some training. I know I've brought this up before, but I'm still of that opinion. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Salmon. Director Yandenardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would really like to see the field trips. I think it's important to see the community. A lot of communities we never get to see and can't really relate when applications come forward. And also, I'm wondering if the training could include not only, and I think Director Toporowski spoke to this, is there any way that we could also include our neighbor First Nations as well in the training? Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other hands, I'm going to put myself back on the list. A couple of things. I mean, you know, it's been, I don't know, 12, 13 years since I was the rookie. But somebody referenced the notion of drinking from a fire hose, and that's exactly what it is for that first 90 days, 120 days. It is absolutely ridiculous. And I say that as somebody who was not at this table then. It was just North Cowichan. And even there, you know, just because they're facing, and the municipalities are facing the same issues around budget, their deadline's a little later, it's May 15th, but still they're in the middle of the budget process, right, you know, coming off the back end of the election. So you're trying to wrap your head around all that. But I think we also need to capitalize on the enthusiasm of the newly electeds. And by that I mean, I don't see a problem with compressing, well, there may be some problems, but I think it's preferable to try to compress that training into a 2.5 week time slot and just pour it on. But then, you know, as somebody mentioned earlier, maybe record those sessions so that as a refresher, folks can go back later and do it again. The joint session, Brian, between the municipalities and the regional district, I think was brilliant. Every year or every 4-year cycle now, I look forward to that because it tends to build a little bit of broader perspective among the municipal electeds and the electoral area folks that, you know what, really we're all in the same game and we're all governed to some degree by the same principles of governance, although there are some idiosyncrasies within a regional district model that don't exist elsewhere. But, you know, the one employee model and you know, the code of conduct stuff and those things are kind of ubiquitous and apply to all of us. And I think in the interest of everybody's time, as well. It's more efficient to do this in a single shot. So yes, I would have, and again, I'm not going to be here, but I would have some concerns if we go too far down the budget pathway and make too many assumptions before the election, because the newly electeds, you know, whoever they are, may walk in and be somewhat offended and say, you know what, you guys have made all the decisions already, and damn it, I was elected to make changes here. It may not be a good way to get those relationships going on a good foot. So, and I recognize staff is sensitive to that, and the final decisions won't be made till after the election, but just, we need to somehow provide some balance and some maneuverability in there so we don't back ourselves into a corner and then end up in a position where we're into a fight before we even really get out of the gate with the new board. So I guess those would be my cautions. Brian?
If I could, Mr. Chair, I think that's where the support from this board is important to pave the way potentially for that to happen, because the benefits are material. They are material when it comes to approving your budget in December versus approving it in March. The cost differences. So just to, you know, in communicating that to the new board, to say that move to a more accelerated budget approval was definitely not done out of potential disrespect for the new board, but an understanding that it has measurable benefits. And then we find that balance to make sure that the new board gets up to speed and has that ability to make those decisions, so that it isn't a fait accompli when they get elected. And so that'll be where staff will step in and try and make sure that we create a process that the new board feels comfortable with and still has the ability to influence.
Director Morrison, and thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just want to confirm that the idea of getting everyone in a bus and taking them around to facilities and just giving all the new board a taste of what this, you know, fantastic region is about is a spectacular idea, and I think sooner the better. I think the idea of condensing this to as compact as we can is important, because I think, as the chair had mentioned, there's a certain amount of excitement and momentum that newly elected folks have, and to find out that, you know, their training is going to spill over into the new year, into January and February, I think isn't productive, and the results were we didn't have full attendance at some of our sessions. I think we even had some canceled. I completely agree with the concept of having all of the elected officials at the local government level, including First Nations, in attendance, because just simple things like irritants that rarely come up, like boundary extensions. Everybody should have a really good idea of what boundary extensions are all about. And if we're all learning it at the same table, I think that's really important. I don't know how you require attendance, but I can tell you I remember very clearly when we were doing some training and, you know, half the group was there. You know, there was important material that the whole group needed to hear. And further to what Director Martman had said, you know, we were a year or two into the term talking about team building when we kind of missed that opportunity right at the beginning when everybody was brand new. And lastly, you know, on the idea of getting the budget done, I think we've got smart enough staff that we can get all of the foundational things, especially capital expenditures, lined up, and a budget that is, in a sense, just about done, with a little bit of flexibility for a new board coming in. You know, mostly a new board, they don't know what they don't know, as opposed to the fine details of the intricate budget that we have at our regional district. So I think it would be incumbent upon us to do the bulk of the heavy lifting around budget, but being cognizant of the fact that people will come in after being newly elected and wanting to do some tinkering around the edges. I think it's unrealistic to think that a new board is going to be able to digest and make effective decisions around a budget as complex as what we have. And staff keep mentioning, especially if we have capital projects, we have such a competitive advantage getting out the door in January on all those parks projects and all those capital expenditures that we have to try and be as effective and efficient as we can. So all of those points, I'm in agreement. Let's move forward and make this as effective for the next board as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Morrison. A few people haven't spoken yet. Director Kuhn, do you have any input? No? Okay. And the alternate directors that are here, I don't know if they have any input. I think staff has a pretty good handle on the feedback that's been received, and Brian, you'll customize something including some of that input.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. This was really valuable. We had sat down a couple of weeks ago as staff to start plotting out. I mean, we need to start doing this work early and booking these events early. And we felt that it was really important to hear from you. So thank you very much for your input, and we will incorporate it into the program for the newly elected board.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R4 is a report from Parks and Trails regarding the 2021 CVRD Parks and Trails Visitation Summary, and this is for information.
All right, no suggested motions. Do we have any questions for staff on this one? Seeing no hands, Ms. Legault.
Mr. Chair, you asked for questions. I just have a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. Questions or comments. That was inferred. Go ahead, Director Action.
I think it just really outlines how important our parks are to us and supports the development of further parks and trails. And just, as far as our parks program goes, staff haven't missed a beat. They're really, I've just received mostly compliments all the time of how nice and enjoyable our parks are. There were, a few instances in the summer or really busy times where the garbage becomes a bit of an overload, but I think that's up to the community as well to help. And there are so many people in our community who go around and pick up, little bits of litter or give a quick call to the Parks Department that a garbage is overflowing. So I just think, I'm just really grateful for where we all live and that we have the ability to get out there and enjoy the park so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Acton. Anybody else? Mr. Farquhar, do you have any comments on this one? I see you popped up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the report is pretty much self-explanatory in terms of the continued enjoyment our communities across the region are experiencing with our network of community parks in our electoral areas and the regional parks in the Cowichan Valley Trail. But as indicated, we are seeing a trajectory of increased use year over year. I think that's very positive in terms of the places we have across the region, and they're getting people outdoors.
How much of this is COVID related? I mean, we in North Cowichan, we saw a huge spike in usage when people had to isolate, and Bonnie Henry said, the only thing you can do is get outside and social distance, but go for a walk and that kind of thing. Are we expecting things to taper off a little bit if and when COVID hits the rearview mirror?
Mr. Chair, certainly as you noticed in the report, we saw quite a significant increase between 2019 and 2020. 2020 over 2021, however, we did see another further 16% increase overall. What we're really noticing, and you look in the report under figures 1 and 3, is not just the popular times of year, summer. We're really seeing an increase in the shoulder seasons, and it's staff's understanding, expectation, and talking with our counterparts, with other local governments, that this is something that I don't think will just be a COVID related and all of a sudden the use is going to drop dramatically. I think COVID, if anything, has provided people an opportunity to get out, find these places in their communities, use them, enjoy them, and they're coming back again and again. So as staff, we're hopeful that the parks and trails we have across the region continue to draw people outdoors because of the health and wellness that these outdoor spaces provide, both mentally and physically, beyond just COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Farquhar. Anybody else? Director Yana DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Mr. Farquhar sort of echoed what I was thinking as well. The people that are using the trails since COVID have found them, and they are increasingly busier and busier. And that is actually a good thing for the health of our community and also the well-being. So it's a benefit to all of us. And I really appreciate what our Parks Department has done. And I always have. So they've done a great job, and we continue to. So thank you.
Director Morris and then Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this through to Mr. Farquhar. You know, it's always great to see the usage numbers going up and you know, the health benefits to all the residents and visitors that get out there. But one thing that I would ask is a lot of our maintenance contracts and the like are based on pre-COVID numbers, and you know, obviously there is wear and tear on our facilities. Have you got a sense as to whether these fairly substantial numbers of users is causing any challenges around the upkeep and maintenance and servicing of you know, all the kilometers of trails in the various different community and regional parks?
Mr. Farquhar.
And Mr. Chair, through to Director Morrison and to the committee, certainly the increase has had an impact in terms of wear and tear. However, as the committee and the board are aware, we recently went through a renewal with our Parks Maintenance Services contract in the middle of COVID, and we did not see much of an increase. However, we are seeing, in particular, let's say hot spots. It was mentioned a bit earlier about you know, porta potties getting rather busy in the summer. So we are seeing that level of service increase specific to porta potties, washrooms, garbage collection. Those, I think, are the main areas that we've noticed a significant increase in terms of servicing requirements. However, overall, in terms of the condition of our parks and trails, the increase in use is not having a dramatic wear and tear on our facilities at this time.
Director Smith.
Thank you. I know that I spend a lot of time in parks all over, and I really enjoy the municipal additions that are within close range to all of us, and all our community parks and trails for electoral areas. One of the things I think is as people are looking at their financial budgets, they know that the trails are free. There isn't an entrance fee, there isn't a parking fee, and that they can take their whole family on an outing, on a picnic, on an explore, and it's not impacting their pockets. So I think that this is really showing, you know, an opportunity for people to get out there at something that doesn't cost them maybe some gas if they're going that direction, but if they're cycling or walking. So I think this is really a positive area that we have definitely invested heavily in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Seeing no other hands, I'll move on. Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R5 is a presentation from the Engineering Services Division on the Corporate Strategic Asset Management Plan Implementation Update, and this is for information, and we have several staff participating in this presentation.
I understand there's a PowerPoint. I guess we'll start with Mr. Carruthers, and he can hand it off to staff. Go ahead, Brian.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted the opportunity to introduce this presentation. This is, as we know, during the budget deliberations, there's been a number of questions that have been asked through the budget around asset management. Where's our program at? What progress have we made? And we are at a very critical juncture with implementing our new asset management platform. So we felt it was appropriate to bring this forward to the committee at this time. I also wanted to, yep. Sorry.
Just before we get going, we have found, and I'm just sort of overlaying a North Cowichan paradigm here, but we found that these PowerPoints work best if everybody turns their video feed off to preserve bandwidth. And please hold your questions to the end because I can't see everybody anyway and I might miss your hand. So just turn your video off and let staff run it. And then when the PowerPoint's done, we'll open it up for questions. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to clarify as well. So asset management has always been a function that's been embedded in the engineering department. And as you know, we have had discussions around restructuring of our organization. We had a discussion and thoughts around moving asset management into the new operations department. But at the end of the day, in terms of looking at the role that asset management plays across the entire organization and its interrelationship with finance and GIS, we have felt that the most appropriate department for asset management to sit is in corporate services, and we have made that move. So Mr. Tokarik, who is our asset management coordinator / energy manager, and it's important to note that Austin plays two roles. And he is now reporting to corporate services, and that's why you're seeing Ms. Mohan, and she'll be introducing her staff as we undertake this presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tokarik, who is going to start the presentation.
Thanks, Brian, and good morning to everybody on the call here. Just to reiterate a couple things Brian mentioned, asset management is a team sport and requires input from multiple disciplines, including finance, engineering, planning, GIS. Successful implementation is going to require collaboration from all levels of staff, from outside operating staff to inside technical staff, managers, and the board to succeed. And it is important to recognize also, as Brian mentioned, it's not just one thing. It's not just the software system that we're currently implementing, but it's a combination of the skilled individuals, the defined processes we've established to determine how best to manage our data, manage our projects and our infrastructure, and also what financial strategies we're going to apply, and what operating and maintenance strategies we're also going to apply to ensure that we get the most useful life out of our infrastructure. And sustainable service delivery is the ultimate objective at the end of the day. And so I'm just going to take the next few minutes to walk you through the implementation of the CVRD's strategic asset management plan. And I would just recognize that there are going to be multiple presenters, including Barb Mohan, the GM of Corporate Services, and we are going to actually going to introduce Chantel Yates there to speak a bit about asset retirement obligations, and then if we miss anything, Mark Boysen will clean up at the end of the presentation here. But so moving on here, this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. This graphic, I'd just like to include this graphic, which was created in 2019, so that it does need to be updated, but this is part of our corporate strategic asset management plan that really just it describes the scope of the services that CVRD delivers, and recognizing, you know, there's a huge variety of services from water and sewer and drainage and parks and recreation and emergency planning, and I would also, including also the Performing Arts Center, of course, and street lighting systems. It is quite a huge breadth of services that are being delivered. And I think it's also important to note that the CVRD operates more independent water and sewer services than any other regional district in BC. So I believe it was 2020, right before COVID shut down, the board approved the strategic asset management plan, which was a set of actions for improving and sustaining asset management practices across the CVRD. It ensures that these practices are applied consistently across the CVRD. It helps the CVRD maintains its asset at appropriate condition levels and maximizes their useful lives. And it establishes data-driven decision-making frameworks to enable the most effective actions on the right assets at the right time while balancing risk and affordability. So just a little snippet here. Also, this is included in our strategy here. This is the FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities Asset Management Readiness Scale. This is a tool developed by FCM that municipalities can use to gauge their readiness or maturity in developing or implementing an asset management program. So I just wanted to include this here to show you. They broke it down into 5 different knowledge areas, and you can kind of rate your organization's performance based on a defined set of criteria as to where you are on this scale. If you do want to dive deep into it, the link to the documents at the bottom that shows you exactly where we are. But just for example, you know, the people in leadership metric here, you know, you do get points, or you know, credits towards improving your people in leadership score by, you know, implementing or developing, you know, implementing asset management language into your job descriptions and whatnot. So again, building out integrating asset management principles throughout the organization. Next slide here. This is just a timeline of asset management activities over the years. It's a lot of information on this slide I tried to pack in here, but I think one, it's important to recognize that capital asset tracking actually started back in 2012 with the finance and their PSAB reporting requirements. But it wasn't until 2016 when there was that was when I started as the asset management coordinator. We formalized the asset management steering committee and developed the asset management policy. Then in 2017, we refreshed the asset inventories and ran some condition assessments to get a better understanding of what the infrastructure is included in our asset portfolio. And that was when we came up with, also that work followed into the state of the infrastructure report. We also developed climate risk assessment framework and a levels of service framework in 2018. And that was when we put some, the scope around our asset portfolio was $363 million. So then again, in 2019, we refreshed the asset management policy to include some of the frameworks that we had developed around levels of service and climate risks. We started preparing the strategy document. We did do an energy study refresh also in 2019, which I think is important to recognize because our approach to energy management has been that when infrastructure comes to the end of its life, that's when we look at the options for improving energy efficiency. And then in 2020, we had the strategic asset management plan was adopted by the board. We continued with more infrastructure assessments out of Binks Creek. 2021 is when, there was a bit of a lag due to COVID, but we started the software procurement for our asset management software system. We revamped our steering committee terms of reference, and we started with some of the process mapping needed to successfully implement the asset management program. And then that brings us up to 2022, where we're now actively implementing the citywide asset management software system. We've started with a pilot project with the water management division. Currently have our Beatus Ridge water system is almost in the system and ready to go live. We just need to update some of the GIS data. But there is more work planned this year in terms of condition assessment, identifying asset retirement obligations, preparing sustainable service delivery plans. And then if all the condition assessments are complete, we would then be able to refresh our state of infrastructure report back to the board. Moving forward, there are other items planned for the asset management program developments around risk management, project management, maintenance management, and long-term financial planning. And of course, natural capital assets needs to fit in there somewhere as well. That was just a placeholder at 2024. If we can get action on that sooner, we would take that. But I guess at the end of the day here, what's important to recognize is that $363 million worth of assets. The total expenses invested to date are only $574,000, which is less than 1% of the value of the infrastructure that we're charged with maintaining. And I think this is my last slide before I hand it over to Barb, but just I know there was some interest in understanding how gas tax community works funds are being applied to the asset management capacity building across the project or across the organization. So this is the latest kind of budget planning document I have, or how asset management is utilizing the Community Works Fund. A lot of the projects you see in 2022 were pushed out from 2021 due to COVID, and we're going to do our best to finish those this year. But the big project is definitely the asset management software system implementation. It's going to impact all divisions that are managing infrastructure, and we're heavily relying on the Community Works Fund to support that project. And now I believe I'm going to hand it over to Barb.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to give you just this sort of top level view of where we are with respect to the asset management program. So asset management really began back in around 2006 to 2009 when the Public Sector Accounting Board required that local governments started reporting their tangible capital assets financially. And really this represents the start of formal asset management for municipalities and local governments. So prior to this time, the concept of detailed asset management was probably well known in the private sector, but really hadn't been applied to the public sector. And so while some of this work seems probably to most people to be sort of self-evident, it hasn't really been part of the local government industry until such time as the Public Sector Accounting Board required that we start reporting our tangible capital assets. And so that was the beginning. Subsequent to that, as per the timeline that Austin has presented, the first step for us was really building our asset inventories. And so while we don't have every single asset inventoried, we have a large proportion of our assets now inventoried. And then if you consider the scope and the size and the number of assets that we're dealing with, it only makes sense that at some point we will need a software management system to continue to track all the information that is associated with those assets so that we can plan for preventative maintenance, that we understand the conditions associated with them, that we understand as they deteriorate, what maintenance is required in order to maintain the service level that we have defined for the public around those assets. And so the asset management software implementation is sort of a huge step forward in our program. And we're really excited to see the first sort of water system get into the software. And once that's finished and we've sort of debriefed that pilot, then assets that are the responsibility of other divisions and departments can start to be loaded into the asset management software system. And then we will start to really be able to manage our assets with full information going forward. So as they're loaded into the system, we're trying to make sure that the GIS information is coordinated with them, and you'll see a screenshot about that in a minute. It will be sort of an uneven process where sometimes we'll have the GIS information and the coordination with GIS, and sometimes we won't, but eventually we will get there. And then once we have all our assets in there and we have completed the other parts of our asset management program, we will have a fully implemented asset management system. But we're some ways away from that yet. We're definitely somewhere between completing asset inventories and having everything loaded into our information system. So next slide. So this is a screenshot of the asset management software that we're implementing this year. This is sort of an example slide showing the positioning of fire hydrants. So you can see that when coordinated with GIS or geospatial data, you can see that you can see where every fire hydrant is, and you can pull up each fire hydrant and determine sort of what year it came into being, what its condition-based status is, what kind of maintenance might be planned on it, whether there were any service issues occurring with that piece of infrastructure over the last year. And then the charts on the right of this slide show sort of comparing one year over the next in terms of how many issues or how much activity there's been associated with that asset over the year. So you can see this is a very powerful software that we're implementing, and hopefully we'll one day have a complete inventory that we can access through this software. So before we go further, I'd like to just at this point introduce Chantal Yates. So Chantal joined us in 2021 as our new Manager of Financial Operations. And much as sort of our journey with asset management began from the finance perspective, we are once again at a place where financial regulations and requirements for our assets are changing. And Chantal is going to explain a little bit about how we now have an obligation to report on our asset retirement costs.
Thank you. So an asset retirement obligation, or an ARO, it's a legal obligation associated with the retirement of a tangible capital asset. This is a new public sector accounting standard. It's mandatory and it's an audit requirement. We need to have the obligation recorded in our financial statements. And some examples of typical AROs would be asbestos within buildings or water mains, removal of underground fuel costs, removal of underground fuel storage tanks, and the cost with closing a landfill. And some items that are typically not AROs would be unplanned cleanup costs, routine replacements, or costs incurred as a result of an accident. Excuse me. So our first step is to identify items that are within the scope of the standard and that meet the recognition criteria for the AROs. Data collection is included in the infrastructure condition assessment supplemental for 2022, and as well a hazardous materials assessment may be required. So once we have a list of the AROs for the CVRD, then we need to come up with some estimates. So we need to estimate the cost that it will need to be recorded, as well as an estimate of when the asset will be retired. So the majority of the work for this this new accounting standard will be right at the start in the implementation, and then going forward there will be continuous monitoring, and we'll need to make sure that if there's any changes to site conditions over time, that those are updated. And then going forward, we need to update annually for our financial statements. So with that, funds will need to be established to cover the cost of the AROs. We can set reserves up going forward and start putting money away in the next budget cycle. And this will help smooth the costs over the life of the asset. This new standard, it's going to be effective for the CVRD for the year ending December 31st, 2023. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that this will help improve the information in the financial statements for the users to show the full cost of the TCA, but also it will help with the environmental impact. So it will help the CVRD to be good, responsible stewards of our assets and to help clean up our assets and know the costs of them going forward. So thank you, and I will pass it back to Barb.
So this slide is showing sustainable service delivery plans. So after we have sort of cataloged an asset and done a condition-based assessment, the next step for us is really to create a sustainable service delivery plan around that asset. And it identifies sort of what level of service we expect that asset to provide the community over its life cycle. And then, what kinds of risks and hazards might come up around that particular asset, and how do we provide for those in advance. So sort of a preventative and ongoing maintenance plan. And so we have identified that with the larger assets that we have cataloged in our inventory, that we need to develop 68 sustainable service delivery plans. So this is ongoing work, and we've done a small portion of these and have a lot of work yet to do. But this basically outlines sort of like the management document for the asset over its life cycle. And so you can see that there's quite a number that we need to do. So this is the final slide, and it just sort of tells you what our ambitious work plan is for 2022. As Austin noted, several work items had been pushed forward into this year from 2021. And so what we're really trying to focus on right now is the implementation of the asset management software, but you'll see that there's a number of different things going on. So condition assessments are usually scheduled to recur every 3 or 4 years so that we can update our knowledge of what condition the different assets are in. And so that's happening this year. Chantel has mentioned that we're going to be doing the work around identifying and quantifying the asset retirement obligations. The corporate risk management framework is a project around identifying risks of deterioration or failure of assets, and how do we provide for those, either from a maintenance point of view or a replacement point of view. So that is work. That's a project that has been pushed into this year from 2021, and we hope to get that done. Levels of service focus groups are happening, and those both inform the risk management framework, but also the sustainable service delivery plans. The ARO reporting will be included, hopefully included on financial statements by the end of the year. The asset management software implementation is there, and we do have a consulting project manager helping us with that implementation. And then a state of the infrastructure report to the board in Q4. And so that is reliant on us being able to complete the condition assessments and asset inventories, which is the number one on this slide. And so then we should be able to come back to the board and say, okay, well, this is what the condition of the assets were in the last state of infrastructure report, which was, I think, 4 years ago. And now here we are now, this is what's changed. So, and then, as I mentioned, we have quite a work plan of sustainable service delivery plans that we need to get completed. And then in the background, while this is all going on, we continue to do capacity building with staff who are involved in their departments and divisions with asset management, and that training will be ongoing throughout 2022. So I'm going to end it there and just open it up for questions, and thank you for listening. Yeah. And thank you to Austin for preparing the presentation, and for Chantal for coming in and explaining to us about asset retirement obligations.
Good stuff. Thank you very much to all the staff for the presentation. Thank you to the board committee members for their patience. Ian has an unfair advantage, Director Morrison, because he's in the room and he waved at me. He wants to speak, so I'll let him go first. But I see we've got Director Salmon raising his hand and Director Justice, and we'll leave it there for now. Go ahead, Director Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've got a couple of comments, and I hope you can indulge me a little bit here. Thank you for the great report, and I think that this is a very complex but very important part of the work that this organization has to do. And you know, I like the comment early on about it being an accounting standard that we need to meet, but from the elected officials' perspective, when the senior levels of government said that we're not going to give you grants unless you're doing this work, it became clear that we had to do the work. So, you know, as an early adopter of and supporter of this, I'm glad to see all that's being done here. It's pretty complex, and one of the issues that I'm a little concerned about is how are we to be explaining this to the people that elected us? Because this is really important work, and as part of the background as to why we're doing this, for 50 years we were given grant money to build arenas and various different bits of infrastructure, and there was none of these requirements. And now we're being asked to put monies aside and do all of the work that's just been outlined here, and it wasn't done before. And people are actually really surprised when they hear that local government wasn't doing asset management, especially if they came from the private sector. So now we are, and where I'm going with this is there is a cost to this, and what I want to be able to do is explain to people in the community, not everything that we just had explained to us here, but there's a cost. And I saw a figure there of 744,000 or something like that. So that would be, what, 1/10 of 1% of an annual budget, but that was spent over 5 years. When I was learning about asset management, they were talking about having it as a reported percentage or number that was part of your annual budget, so that we could point to it and say, 1.5% of this 4.5% increase is strictly due to asset management. So I appreciate the numbers that were reported in this presentation, but there's also all of those dollars that are going into the individual capital reserve funds that vary from function to function, that we don't have an idea what those numbers are. So what I'm asking is, is the new software, and is our staff building towards a time where we can report to our public that we're doing this great work. It's included in our budget, and we can point to a number that's part of our budget, whether it be a dollar amount or a percentage, where we can say, and this is what we're required to do, and this is how much it costs. Because I think that's a really important thing to do. Nowhere in this report, like you're reporting to us as a committee and a board, but we have to report to the public. And we need to be able to do it in a fairly clear, concise, and straightforward way so that they understand what that number is as part of the budget and why we're doing it. So any thoughts on whether we will see a number and part of this reported out as a function of our budget exercise?
Who wants to take that? Mr. Carruthers.
I'm going to start, and I'm going to ask my staff to weigh in. I see there being two numbers. So the actual direct cost of developing and implementing the asset management system was outlined on that progress chart that Mr. Tukarik had showed earlier, in terms of how much we've invested, not in terms of the money put aside to actually upgrade the infrastructure, but just to develop the program. And you would have seen that was 0.15% of the total value of the $363 million in assets that we own and are responsible for. So it's a very, very small investment relative to the assets. The next number is what Director Morrison, I think, just spoke to, is what are we doing in terms of actually putting that money aside to repair, to replace, to climate change proof our assets, those kinds of things. And that's where I'm going to have, finance speak to that, because, we're able to report out in a basis that the elected officials would like us to report out. If there's some communication that needs to be had with our communities around this program and the value that our taxpayers are getting for the investments that we're making, we can work with the board to develop that kind of a reporting mechanism. The software that we're implementing will have significant, robust reporting capacity in terms of the data. You just saw a quick sample that showed just a suite of fire hydrants. You extrapolate that across all of our assets, I think we'll be in a really good position to be able to show the citizens how we're doing in managing our assets. And I see there being significant cost savings in the future because of predictability, because we will be maintaining our assets when they need to be maintained and mitigating the chance of failure, ensuring that they're being upgraded appropriately. And so there's all kinds of less tangible cost benefits to the work that we're doing. But with that said, I'll turn it over to Barb and to any of her staff that may want to provide some more detail.
I see Austin is eager.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to say a couple of things, and then I'll pass it over to Austin because he really is the expert on the topic. But I do think, as Brian has said, that there's ways of communicating this to the public in really understandable formats. To me, in addition to sort of the soft costs of running a management system, there are definitely ways, I think, to show what's gone into reserves for asset replacement and what's gone into reserves for asset retirement. But I don't, beyond that, while the formal asset management program is a relatively recent phenomenon in local government, really the business of taking care of our assets is something that we've always done. So it's a little bit, it's a complex picture, and just those two sort of types of reserve activities don't really encapsulate the whole picture of taking care of our assets. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to let Austin fill in the gaps, and then I noticed that Natalie is also on screen, so she can probably provide some information as well.
Austin, then Natalie.
Thanks. Through the chair here, I guess with regards to the communications, the intent I get is one, there's the state of the infrastructure report, which is will be publicly available. And previously we had identified the 10-year kind of renewal requirements, that investment required to maintain infrastructure at the current level of service that it delivered. And I believe it was 35 million over 10 years was identified in 2018. And then the challenging part is the financial strategies to either apply those funds or save that money really varies between every service that we deliver because we're a regional district, which is unfortunate. And then the other piece to the communication side question is that the sustainable service delivery plans, the intent there is that those will be, those will be easy to read and digestible documents that will clearly articulate the kind of long-term financial requirements for each individual water system or each park or whatever, or however we prepare those. But that's where that information will be documented and communicated. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Weiner.
Through the chair to Director Morrison, there's definitely some steps that need to take place. The first one is definitely getting the data and the information all into the system. And then we need to tie it to the budget process so we can start tracking those maintenance costs, what it costs to maintain our assets. And currently, we have to go back and look at our capital reserve policies and look at, there's not actually budgeted amounts that going into capital reserves for the replacements at this point in time. For some items are very good, other ones not so much, and that's because they're smaller services, so it's a little bit more challenging. So that's where we need to have the information come in, look at the renewal plan. That's all part of the asset management financial planning portion that needs to happen. Data in first, then we tie to the budget, and then the board can make some decisions when they go forward on capital of where the asset's at, where its lifespan is, and that's where the software is great because it'll show it as this is urgent, it needs this replacement versus the other side. And I think that will help the constituents if they can see even on sort of like a heat map type of situation saying these are all high, they need replacement, this is why, this is where your tax dollars are going towards.
Thank you, Ms. Weiner. I see you, Director Wilson. I'll put you on the list. I'm just going to add a little something in response to Director Morrison's question. I mean, the responses from staff have been focused very much on the minutia of the money, and I get that, and that's important, and it's very much a piece of this. But the political piece, because I heard you ask Director Morrison, how do we explain this to our constituents? I was chair of what was then the Island Savings Center Commission, now the Community Center Commission, back in, 2011 or 12. And staff at that point came to us, and this was before asset management was the buzzword, and said, you know what, this center is 37 or 38 years old, and at some point it's going to need to be replaced, and we need to do we'd like to start a reserve fund so that when the time comes, we have some money so that potentially we can match what was then the convention was 30-30-30 from the feds, the province, and local governments. So we said, well, we're going to do some community consultation on that, and we took that thing on the road. And as chair of the commission at that time, I always started the presentation, and this applies in spades to what we're talking about here. I started the presentation with a very simple little anecdote. I said, my daughter called me the other day, Dad, and said, Dad, we've just paid off the minivan. I said, oh, that's nice. Now you got an extra $200 a month in the budget. She goes, no, you know what? We're so used to making that payment that we're just going to keep putting $200 a month in the bank. And when this minivan wears out, we don't have to borrow to replace it. And I have used that example for asset management throughout, and people get it when you explain it to them that way. So that's just a simple little story, but it kind of illustrates what it is we're trying to do here. Who have I got next? Director Salmon, then Justice, then Kuhn, then Wilson. Director Salmon.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you. That was a helpful presentation, and thank you, Austin, for leading the charge for these years. Just a big picture question. Do we know how we're doing on this compared to other local governments broadly? And is there sort of a forum where you share best practices and lessons learned and all that in asset management?
Sure, I can take that one. Thank you, Director Salmon. Through the chair. Well, Asset Management BC is definitely the local or the provincial body of knowledge that kind of brings all asset management practitioners together from across the province. And then as far as where we are in relation to other organizations, my impression is we're further ahead than most, but we did take a bit of time to kind of get all our ducks in a row before implementing the software system, which I think is an important step that a lot of organizations don't do, and they jump into the software without really being ready for it, which that's where it's taking a bit longer to get there, but I think we're taking the best approach according to Asset Management BC at least.
Okay,
And if I could add to that, Mr. Chair, if you want to respond to that in relative to other regional districts, I would say that if we aren't the front runner of all the regional districts, we're certainly one of the front runners, because regional districts are more complicated, obviously, to apply something like this to. And so we are well in advance, and Austin and myself have spoken on a number of occasions in different forums about our experience, because we're seen provincially as a leader in asset management.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry, hit the wrong button. Director Justice.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, I guess, was partially answered in the response to Director Morrison, but I do have a question about the new accounting standards, I guess for Ms. Mohan, perhaps. As I understand it, our financial statements report only the undepreciated value of our tangible capital assets, and not any increases in replacement costs. So I guess in addition to dealing with the future costs of hazardous asset retirement, will the new accounting standards also mean that our infrastructure replacement obligations will need to be reflected in the overall assessment of our financial position?
So I am going to pass this question on to Natalie because she will be able to better answer than I can.
Ms. Weiner?
Through the chair to Director Justice. Unfortunately, no replacement value, still accounting standards is always looking, finance looks back, but they are starting to move towards looking forward, and that is the asset retirement obligations. That's the forward facing piece. So if there's an obligation, say there's asbestos in a building and the building has a lifespan of say another 5 years, it's a requirement now under the new standards that so much money is put away till the end of that asset. So when it's ready to be retired, that the funds are already there at the current value at that time to be able to go and retire the obligation. So that is a little bit of something that's unique right now to accounting, since we're usually looking back on our financial statements. But it's requiring us to budget and put in there for future retirement of our assets.
Thank you. If I might just briefly follow up. So there's a distinction to be made here between assets that are being retired and assets that are being replaced, and assets that have a hazardous aspect to them and assets that don't. So would this be like a first step towards a new accounting procedures that actually look forward?
Through the chair to Director Justice, this is actually replacing a lot of the contaminated sites regulations that finance had within their financial statements, where we had to record the liability. So this legislation is coming forward for this, and it's not replacement of all assets. The asset retirement obligations are only for hazardous materials, and so it's that environmental portion that is being captured and forward facing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Director Justice. Moving on to Director Kuhn, then Wilson, and then Smith.
I have a question with regard to the chart that shows the FCM-AM readiness scale CVRD. There is a rating system. Who determines at what rating we are currently? Do we determine that? Does FCM determine that, or where do we sit with this?
Mr. Tokarik's eager to answer that one. Go ahead.
Thanks, Director Kuhn, through the chair. Currently, it's being the ratings are being assessed by on the either through the executive steering committee or just with one of the other asset management groups that are meeting regularly as a part of our implementation team.
So that's internal, then, just to be clear.
Internal.
Okay.
Yeah, and so further to that, Mr. Chair, there's criteria that you base your rating on. So it's just not an arbitrary. You have to meet certain things that help you to determine what rating you're at, and so it is an internal rating system. We haven't had somebody come in and audit us yet relative to that.
Director Kuhn, follow up.
Just one more comment. there was discussion about maybe tying the dollar amount or the amount of expenditures for the asset management into a percentage of the assets. And things like that are being done quite often, that certain expenses are tied to an asset or another performance form, so that in a way we're then locked in. So there's no more flexibility. If the assets increase, oh, well, okay, we'll have to spend so much more money. And what makes me think is, so at the end of the scale in 2024, we show natural capital. Well, I mean, that would leave an incredible amount of leeway, because who determines as to, and how do we determine as to what the natural assets are? How much are they valued at? And if we tie a percentage to that, well, hallelujah. I mean, there's zillions of money to be spent, because it just depends on how we set the asset value. So I'm a little bit leery about just saying, oh, well, let's set it to the asset value. I'm leery about tying the board down in a way that later on we have hardly any way to move, because, well, we decided, it was a board decision. Remember, we decided that this be tied to the asset, and now, so I like flexibility, and my fear is that maybe we'll get tied in too much. So anyway, that's just a comment.
Thank you, Director Kuhn. And Brian, what I'm hearing, the undertone here is that valuing these things can be somewhat subjective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of the natural assets, our fixed assets are much easier to value, and there's engineering standards and cost estimating that we can utilize to get relatively accurate values. That is part of the reason why the natural asset component has been pushed off, because it is still a work in progress. There's a few local governments that are doing some work, and there's a branch of Asset Management BC that's continuing to do work on valuing natural assets. But as Director Kuhn appreciates, that's going to be a very subjective exercise. And I think, I would sooner be doing this when there's a little bit more accuracy and some more examples of how that's done moving forward before we jump into it. Not to mention, we've got a lot to do just to deal with our engineered assets, our fixed assets. So, but that'll be further discussion for future boards around how we value natural assets.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. I've got Wilson, then Smith. Any other hands? I see Director Martman wants to speak. Director Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been said over and over again that asset management is nothing new. It isn't. It's just something that seems to be new to local governments, but it's been around in industry for a long, long time. But one of the things that has come up, and I think it's touched on already, is the maintenance and replacement, the ratings, the forecasting of replacement items or maintenance times. Question for Mr. Tokarek: is there a bandwidth or a time period for replacement, or is it an absolute? For instance, is it possible to set a user-defined option for configuration? Or do you say, okay, we're going to say that somewhere between 2023 and 2024, this one needs to be replaced? Or does the program itself say it must be replaced at this time? Is this configurable, or is it absolute?
Mr. Descartes.
Thank you for the question through the chair. It is configurable. You can use either or. If you have a date, and those dates are generally, I believe those are some financial or engineering standards we use to get an estimated useful life for each piece of infrastructure. And then if we do know the condition rating of the equipment, we can adjust that useful life based on, I think there's water systems, I believe, in some of our areas that are well beyond their estimated useful life, but are still operating within the levels of service required. So it comes down to the service. If you can deliver the service on a piece of infrastructure that is beyond its useful life, then we can adjust that in the software.
Yeah, thank you. A follow-up, please, Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure, that sounds good. That would be normal practice as well. So if I understand it correctly, going back to one of the other things that was said just now, excuse me, that decision will be made internally by the engineering staff or those in charge of it, or let's assume that we have very good engineers, no two ways about that. But let's assume that we need external help to be able to say, yes, this is good. Is that the kind of thing that's going to be brought in as well? So we get the absolute top end of the opinions as to whether this has to be replaced or whether it can be extended.
I see Mr. Boyson's popped up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just thought sorry, I don't think you could see me on there, but I have been here the whole time. So I just wanted to touch base on that when it comes to the decision making. So if we have these regular condition assessments that will help us in our decision making process. So that's going to be this external review, and so you've seen it in the budget this year for us to be able to have these condition assessments updated, see where things are at. But there's also then our operations on the ground, people who are actually using our staff who are using the equipment and seeing how well it works and does it meet our provincial and VHA reporting requirements. We're going to keep using that equipment as long as we can. So we'll have that external piece as a part of those condition assessments. And then, of course, every year when we do decide to replace something, there's part of the budget process for us to then make sure that we explain to the board exactly why we think it's time for this item to be replaced.
Are you good, Director Wilson? Because, just following up on that, some of this is subjective. Brian talked about the subjectivity of the natural assets thing, but, I talked earlier about the community center. According to sort of the standards out there, that building should have been knocked down about 7 or 8 years ago. But because we've got such rock stars there doing the management, and I think of, people like Mr. Coleman, it's an amazing facility, and I don't know, it's going to last another 20 years. So, there has to be some flexibility built in, and I believe we're doing that with the sort of on-the-ground staff input, and in the case of recreation centers, also through the commissions that sort of help administer them. Director Smith, then Martman.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's comments and especially the responses from the staff. One of the things I noticed was in 2023 that we're going to be looking at the integrate to the long-term financial plan. Is that something that we should be looking at in 2022 with new assessments, or this is then moving over to 2023? That would be whether we should have that move forward, or I'm sure you've got it in the right position. And then one of the other questions was, what is the makeup of the levels of service focus groups that would be for that? And one other tiny little thing is environmental costs. So we're looking at hazardous materials is part of the environmental costs, and that the long-term financial plan would have to figure in these environmental costs.
I'm going to stop you there,
Thank
Director
you.
Smith. That's
Yep.
That's three questions, all wrapped up in one. Not sure who wants to take these. Austin, go ahead.
I can start. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the first question was about long-term financial plans and kind of timing for those. My approach here is the data that we're going to collect in these condition assessment refreshes this year in 2022 will then we'll be able to use to inform any long-term financial projections moving forward. But so it's going to be contingent upon completing that project. The second question was around levels of service focus groups. Those will be we're going to be, I haven't really figured out the selection criteria yet, but the specific users of specific asset systems like the rec centers will be used in the focus groups to determine appropriate levels of service, whether the current levels appropriate or what other levels of service they would want to see there in the future, which again can then also be used to inform long-term financial plans. And then the last question, it was something about AR. I can't remember the last question. Sorry.
See, that's why we don't ask 3 questions. Director Smith, your last question. Oh, I think Mr. Boyson's got that one covered. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just take a quick crack at it. I think it was about the environmental piece. So it's very limited in scope. It's very clear about what those requirements are. For us, primarily a big one is asbestos, and it's actually more than environmental. It's the health and safety piece of it. And so some of the presentations that we've been listening in on that are supporting all the municipalities and regional districts as they implement this is some of the info coming out about how important this asbestos management issue and actually what it's having now as the leading cause of death from workplace incidents. And this is the way from people who've been exposed to it in previous poor practices. So it's very specific in the areas, and we've got our accounting firm that KPMG, who we're working with now, who are reviewing our financial statements each year. They're going to be they've been providing some input and advice as well, just to make sure we're really clear about the scope of the work and how far we have to delve into understanding these issues. But the environmental piece, I'd say, is those contaminated sites discussions and landfill pieces. But then there's also some health and safety components there too, but the scope is quite specific and well defined for us as we get through all this information.
Thank you, Mr. Boyson. Are you good, Director Smith, or have you got 3 more questions? I wouldn't let you do that. Thank you. I've got Director Martman. Didn't see any other hands. If somebody wants to get on the list, raise your hands now. All right, Director Martman, go ahead, and then Director Smith again.
Oh, Director Smith's jumping in there, or she's going after me. Okay, thank you. I turned my video off again. And thank you, and I appreciate this, and I was reviewing the readiness matrix and the information behind building it, and I'm interested. In work I've done previously, we've used readiness matrix, but I know this is internal, but the ones I've used in the past have also included the community. And I think that goes to a lot of comments before about, where are we with informing the community, having engagement with the community so that they are buying into this. And so that's just a feature that might add a 6th variable or a 6th dimension to this that might be considered. But when I look at this and I drill down into, where we are today and looking at from 2016 to 2019 to today, and you're looking at the gray, and I'm seeing that work needs to be done in the contribution to asset management practices, and needs to build out from level 3 to 4 to 5. I'm considering where are the vulnerabilities, because all of this discussion has to deal with the fact that we're going to talk about budgets and we're going to make decisions on which, will we be able to have certain personnel in place? Should we be hiring people? And do you have the resources to carry this forward, to get to those 3, 4, and 5 levels in each of these areas? So are there vulnerabilities that we're facing in decisions tomorrow? And this is the appropriate place to ask, I guess, maybe, because this is really around a budget-related question around personnel and saying, do we have the resources personnel-wise, and was that, I guess that's sort of where I'm going. Like, someone take that on as a question.
I think Mr. Boyson, Ms. Mohan wants to take this. I don't know. One of you go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
I don't think we have a proper answer for you on that. I think part of this is all the benefits of asset management is just for us to have more information so we make good decisions. And I think that's what we would have, is be able to have, as we get through these initial implementations and having some real specific information that helps us with financial planning, but staff planning as well. So we just have better information. So yeah, we hope to include that. I mean, this is help us to decide about where our workload is heading, and how to consider, new projects and how we build forward in the future. And I just wanted to add one other piece I just think is important just about these strategies. Austin mentioned about, when the number comes down, about how challenging financially it will be just to start to integrate some of these solutions financially, about putting away money. I think what it is a gradual process, is likely how we would implement it down the road. It's a common practice is to come up with a sustainable funding strategy where there's a gradual increase to be able to have sustainable funding in place over time, but it won't be coming all right away. In some areas, and some other strategies that might fit into that are also prioritization of certain areas, like that the board might decide that, certain parts of the water and sewer system gets a higher priority than other assets, but it's just, those are all the types of strategies. I think I just wanted to add a few more comments in there about what Austin was referring to when it comes to dealing with the financial load that's coming down the pipe.
But it is a case of sort of triaging it and saying services that are impacted by health and safety concerns, like, water standards, drinking water standards, get a higher priority than some of the other stuff.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. And I think this ARO discussion is actually the beginning of some, before the pressure was from the boards and from the province, from the grant funding perspective, on us being able to make sure we have an accountable asset management system. But this ARO piece is sort of the beginning start of a portion of the asset management system being actually a part of our financial reporting each year. That's likely going to just expand into the rest of our asset management systems over time.
Ms. Mohan.
I just wanted to add a piece about sort of the integrative nature of asset management and how it affects overall staff capacity. So, I mean, we're used to associating asset management with Austin, and while he's the coordinator of the program, the activities associated with the program outside of even just the software implementation, they affect all staff, right? They affect staff who need to take care of assets, who need to be able to be in the field cataloging assets, who need to be able to use the asset management software to do their maintenance programs, et cetera. So when you consider the budget that you're going to look at tomorrow, there are some positions in there that all have asset management responsibilities. So one of them is in the parks area, where the parks division has a huge number of assets, and providing for the life of those assets is a really big job, and there is additional staffing identified in the budget for supporting that activity. Procurement is another huge one. So as we talk about asset replacement and maintenance of different systems, or planning for capital works, procurement is an area that we are constrained with workload capacity. So those are just two examples, but I mean, even something as simple as understanding that at the general management level, we have sort of a steering committee so that we understand where to focus our priorities around asset management throughout the organization in a strategic fashion. So that is adding to the workload of every general manager. And as you know, there's another general manager position that is being provided for in this budget. So it really, one of the goals of this presentation was to try to show you that asset management is not just a one-man show. It is a team sport. It involves the whole organization, and there are multiple staff members whose capacity is impacted by having to do asset management, increasing levels of asset management work as we go forwards.
Thank you. Director Martin, follow up?
Thank you. I'll go, yes, thanks. Because, I think one of the things that, and I don't know if this is worth some time to explain to us as directors, for taking some time, because as I see level 4 and level 5 of this readiness matrix, and I don't know if everybody's drilled down into it, a lot of what the check boxes that you have in there are about training, are about culture changing. There's a whole variety of things that are very, I would say, resource intensive. They're going to require people doing this work, and this isn't work that we're currently doing. I don't think it's the work that's going to be coming, and I think the community being aware of this, directors being aware of all this work that's in, it just leads it to saying we can support, or at least I speak for myself, able to support, to say, yes, we need to have the people there to do it, or people need to be freed up to do it. And I guess that's sort of the direction I was going from. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Martin. I saw Director
Smith. If I could just respond to that, Mr. Chair. The readiness matrix, it's not something that we're necessarily aspiring to hit level 5 on every one of those quadrants of the matrix. It's really a kind of an assessment tool. Ultimately, we would like to think that when we are fully operational and we have our system completely embedded in our organization, that we would be hitting the top levels of all of those 5 quadrants. But we are doing training. There is ongoing development. We have an executive steering committee. We have an asset management committee that's made up of all of the asset managers. We have had individual staff members that are actually taking training and becoming certified in asset management. So each one of those steps incrementally is helping to improve our culture and embedding it in our organization. And I think there will be, as Ms. Mohan said, some staffing requirements, and they're going to be on a department by department basis. Some departments are better resourced right now to be able to deal with their assets, and others might be. And I think over a series of number of years and implementation, that we will eventually get to those level 4s and level 5s on that matrix without having to actually, kind of deliberately have a path to get there. It's going to happen kind of organically.
Thank you, Mr. Carruthers. Director Smith, I had on the list, but you've just spoken, so I'm going to give it to Director Morrison first and then Smith, unless other hands pop up. Director Morrison.
Thank you. And just, I'm hoping I understood Mr. Boyson's comments in regards to sort of an incremental implementation of some of the costs, because in the presentations that I've seen by Asset Management BC, when they've got to the point where they're launching a program and there's going to be a component of the budget and the costs embedded into the budgeting process. They came about it from sort of two different perspectives. There were examples shown where there was sort of a front-loaded larger cost at the very beginning of the program, and that provided some consistency and generally lower numbers in subsequent and following years. Whereas there was other approaches where they created a number based on demand each year, and that tended to be more variable and a little bit more difficult. And so I see the benefits of both approaches, but I think I've come down in favor of more of a front-loaded system where you can go and explain to the taxpayers that asset management will be a hit to the budget in this year, but will provide future stability. So has something changed that has given staff the inclination to do a more incremental implementation? And do you see that as being more variable in the long run?
Mr. Boyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, I wasn't implying I want to definitely imply that there's a lot of options available there. Not saying that that's the set way. I feel like I think that the general feeling for staff, though, based on that large number that Mr. Turkarik has proposed, is that front-end loaded number is going to be a shocking number, a big tax increase to the community. The board is willing to do that, though. I think staff would be, we will be able to roll out whatever the board wishes, I think, though, but it's, we just understand that I think there's going to have to be some pieces of it in order to absorb it gradually. But I very much appreciate your comments. Different communities do different strategies. Coming from different sizes of communities in my past, I think smaller communities could do things a little differently, but we do have, there'll be some big numbers coming. So I think just to clarify that staff would be listening to the board about what's the best direction and provide options for that.
Thank you, Mr. Boyson. Director Smith.
Thank you. This may be a little off the topic a tiny bit, but we have a lot of water and wastewater systems that are in line to come into the CVRD that they also have issues. So where would they fit into this asset management requirement before they come into the CVRD, so that we are not taking on all that staffing requirement, all that additional work for the CVRD, that they need to come as a package? And I just wanted to know how that fits in. Thank you.
Austin, do we do assessments when we take them on in terms of what we're taking on?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Exactly. There was a updated, I think it was water system, utility takeover policy or terms of reference, and some guidance was prepared within the last few years, I believe. And that is exactly what it states, is that a detailed condition assessment needs to be conducted, inventory established, conditions, ratings applied, replacement values determined, and then you get a more robust picture of what that infrastructure looks like and what kind of liabilities you're getting into if you choose to take over that system.
And also potentially what the cost will be for the users of that system in terms of how we have to dole out parcel taxes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Director Smith? I'm not seeing any other hands. This has been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you to staff for the presentation, and thank you to the directors for some very good probing questions. I think we all have a better understanding of what we're up against here in the next 2 to 3 years as we move into this asset paradigm, or asset management paradigm. Director Toporowski, was that your hand up, or were you just scratching something? Okay, sorry, thank you. Let's move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's no further business items and no requests to participate in question period and no closed session. So on to adjournment.
Now, on that basis, there being no further items on the agenda, I'll declare this meeting adjourned at 11:29 a.m. Thank you all. We'll see you at the board at 1:30.